The rain hammered against the weathered wooden walls of the small ranch house like bullets from an angry sky. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of the harsh Wyoming winter that was approaching faster than anyone had expected. Inside, Jake Morrison sat motionless in his worn leather chair, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The silence that filled his home had become his closest companion over the past 3 years, a silence so profound it seemed to echo through every corner of the modest dwelling. At 42, Jake had built his life around predictability. Every morning at 5:30, he would tend to his small herd of cattle. By 7, he'd be fixing fences or repairing equipment. Lunch was always the same: bread, cheese, and whatever preserved meat he had stored. Evenings were spent reading old newspapers or carving small wooden figures that would eventually find their way to the local church's charity box. Words had become foreign to him, unnecessary tools in a world where actions spoke louder than any conversation ever could. The storm outside was unlike anything the region had seen in decades. Weather reports had warned of severe conditions, but Jake had lived through enough Wyoming winters to know that nature often exceeded even the most dire predictions. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows and making the entire structure creak under the pressure. He glanced at his watch. Nearly midnight. The storm had been raging for 6 hours straight, and there was no sign of it letting up. Jake's weathered hands, scarred from years of ranch work, slowly reached for the cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His dark eyes, framed by premature wrinkles earned through countless hours under the relentless sun, reflected the orange glow of the fireplace. He had learned to find comfort in solitude after losing his wife Sarah in a car accident 3 years ago. The silence had become his armor, protecting him from a world that demanded too much emotional investment. The ranch, though small, was his sanctuary. Inherited from his grandfather, it sat on 200 acres of rugged landscape, surrounded by rolling hills and vast open spaces that stretched toward the horizon. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the closest town, Cedar Ridge, was a 30-minute drive on a good day. During storms like this, the isolation was complete. Jake preferred it that way. People brought complications, emotions, and expectations he was no longer willing to meet. Lightning illuminated the darkness outside, revealing the fury of the storm in stark, momentary clarity. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching toward the ground as if in prayer. The rain came down in sheets so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the windows. Jake's small herd of cattle had taken shelter in the barn, and he had secured everything that could be blown away hours before the storm's arrival. He was prepared for nights like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the sound that cut through the storm's roar like a knife through silence. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was barely audible above the wind, so faint that Jake initially thought he had imagined it. He remained still, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips, listening intently. The storm continued its assault, but there it was again, deliberate, desperate knocking on his front door. Jake set down his cup and stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. Who could possibly be out in weather like this? The roads were undoubtedly flooded, and anyone with sense would have found shelter hours ago. He moved toward the door, his boots echoing against the hardwood floor with each measured step. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. Through the small window beside the door, Jake could see nothing but darkness and the relentless assault of rain. He reached for the heavy wooden door, his hand hesitating on the metal handle. 3 years of isolation had made him wary of unexpected visitors, but something about the desperate nature of the knocking stirred something deep within him, a long-buried instinct to help others that had once defined who he was. Jake pulled the door open, and the storm immediately invaded his sanctuary. Rain and wind rushed into the entryway, soaking his clothes and filling the space with the raw power of nature's fury. But it wasn't the storm that made him freeze in place. Standing on his porch, drenched to the bone and trembling from cold, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long auburn hair plastered to her head and clothes that had once been white but were now stained with mud and rain. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his for just a moment before she spoke. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I have nowhere else to go." It was then that Jake noticed the bundle in her arms, a small baby, wrapped in what appeared to be a soaked blanket. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old, and despite the storm's fury, seemed to be sleeping peacefully against its mother's chest. The woman's arms shook as she held the baby, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, Jake couldn't tell. For a long moment they stood there in the doorway, the storm raging around them while time seemed suspended. Jake's mind raced with questions he couldn't voice. Where had she come from? How had she found his ranch in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this? What circumstances had driven her to seek shelter with a complete stranger? But as he looked at the woman and child soaked and shivering on his porch, all those questions seemed irrelevant. The humanitarian instinct that had been dormant for 3 years suddenly awakened, cutting through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. This wasn't about him or his preference for solitude. This was about basic human decency, about providing shelter to someone who clearly needed it more than he needed his silence. The woman's eyes, despite her obvious exhaustion, held a strength that reminded Jake of his late wife. There was determination there, the kind that comes from surviving unimaginable hardship. She hadn't come to his door as a beggar, but as a mother doing whatever it took to protect her child. In that moment, Jake saw himself reflected in her desperation, the same desperation he had felt when he couldn't save Sarah. The baby stirred slightly in the woman's arms, and Jake noticed how naturally she adjusted her grip, how her entire body seemed to curve protectively around the small bundle. Despite whatever circumstances had brought her to his door, it was clear that this child was her world, her reason for continuing to fight against whatever forces had driven her into the storm. Without a word, Jake stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The woman hesitated for just a moment, perhaps surprised by his immediate acceptance, then stepped across the threshold into the warmth of his home. As she passed him, Jake caught a glimpse of the exhaustion etched into her features, the hollow look of someone who had been running on pure adrenaline for far too long. "Come in," Jake said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse but filled with a warmth that surprised even him. Those were the first words he had spoken to another human being in over 2 weeks, and they felt foreign on his tongue. But as he watched the woman's shoulders sag with relief, he realized that sometimes the simplest words carried the most profound meaning. He quickly closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm and creating a barrier between the chaos outside and the unexpected sanctuary within. The silence that had been his companion for so long was suddenly replaced by the sound of dripping water and the woman's labored breathing as she tried to warm herself and her child. Jake stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do next. His carefully ordered world had just been turned upside down by 2 strangers who had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate need for shelter. But as he looked at the woman and child, he realized that perhaps this disruption was exactly what he needed, a reminder that there was still a world beyond his self-imposed isolation, a world where his actions could still make a difference. The woman remained standing just inside the doorway, water pooling at her feet on the hardwood floor. Her breathing was still labored, and Jake could see her entire body trembling, whether from cold, exhaustion, or fear he couldn't determine. The baby in her arms had begun to stir, making soft whimpering sounds that seemed to pierce through the storm's continuous roar outside. "You're soaked through," Jake observed, his voice still carrying that rusty quality of disuse. He moved toward the small closet near the entrance, pulling out a thick wool blanket that Sarah had knitted during their second winter together. The familiar scent of lavender still clung to the fabric, a ghost of memories he had tried so hard to bury. The woman accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around herself and the baby with practiced efficiency. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with genuine relief. "I didn't know if anyone lived out here. I saw your light from the road," and her voice trailed off as she swayed slightly on her feet. Jake instinctively moved closer, ready to catch her if she fell. Up close, he could see the full extent of her exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, a pallor that spoke of too little food and too much stress, and the way she held the baby with the protective desperation of someone who had been running for far too long. "Sit," Jake said, gesturing toward the couch near the fireplace. "I'll get some dry clothes and something warm to drink." As the woman settled onto the couch, Jake noticed how she never loosened her grip on the baby, even for a moment. The child was awake now, looking around with bright, curious eyes that seemed far too alert for such a young infant. Jake estimated the baby couldn't be more than 3 or 4 months old, with wispy dark hair and features that would undoubtedly develop into something beautiful as the child grew. Jake disappeared into his bedroom, rummaging through drawers for clothes that might fit the woman. He settled on one of his own flannel shirts and a pair of Sarah's old jeans that he had never been able to bring himself to donate. As he gathered the items, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, a man who had grown accustomed to his own reflection being the only human face he saw for days at a time. When he returned to the living room, he found the woman gently rocking the baby, humming a soft lullaby that seemed to calm the child immediately. The scene struck him with unexpected force. It was the first time in 3 years that his home had felt alive, filled with the sounds and presence of other human beings. "These should fit," Jake said, setting the clothes on the coffee table. "There's a bathroom down the hall. Take as long as you need." The woman looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and lingering wariness. "I don't want to impose. If the storm passes, I can—" "The storm won't pass for hours," Jake interrupted gently. "Maybe not until morning. You're not going anywhere tonight." She nodded slowly, understanding the finality in his tone. As she stood to change, Jake caught a glimpse of a faded bruise on her wrist, partially hidden by her soaked sleeve. The sight sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the signs of someone running from more than just bad weather. While she changed, Jake busied himself in the kitchen, preparing hot soup and coffee. The familiar routine of caring for someone else felt strange after so long, but also strangely comforting. He found himself moving with more purpose than he had in months, as if having people to care for had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. The baby's crying brought him back to the living room, where he found the woman, now dressed in his clothes, trying to soothe the child. The flannel shirt hung loose on her small frame, and Sarah's jeans, while closer to her size, still seemed to emphasize how thin she had become. "He's hungry," she said, a note of panic creeping into her voice. "I ran out of formula yesterday and I haven't been able to—" Jake held up a hand to stop her explanation. "I'll drive to town first thing in the morning. There's a 24-hour store that should have what you need." The woman stared at him as if he had just offered her the moon. "You would do that for strangers?" Jake considered the question, surprised by his own certainty. "Yes," he said simply, "I would." As the night wore on, the storm continued its assault on the small ranch, but inside a different kind of transformation was taking place. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Emma, shared bits and pieces of her story between caring for her son. She spoke of traveling from Montana, of leaving everything behind, of needing to start over somewhere safe. She never mentioned the baby's father, and Jake didn't ask. The baby, despite his hunger, seemed to sense the safety of their temporary shelter. He had stopped crying and was now looking around with those bright, alert eyes, occasionally making soft, cooing sounds that filled the silence Jake had grown so accustomed to. As dawn approached, Jake found himself changed in ways he hadn't expected. The presence of Emma and her child had reminded him of who he used to be, a man who helped others, who opened his home to those in need, who believed that actions mattered more than words. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in his home felt empty rather than comforting. The first light of dawn crept through the windows of Jake's ranch house like a hesitant visitor, painting the walls in soft shades of gold and amber. The storm had finally begun to subside, leaving behind a landscape transformed by its fury. Trees lay scattered across the property, their broken branches creating an obstacle course that would take days to clear. The dirt road leading to the main highway had become a river of mud, effectively cutting off any immediate escape from the isolated ranch. Jake stood at the kitchen window, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had weathered many such storms. Behind him, Emma sat at the small dining table, cradling her son against her chest. The baby had finally fallen asleep after a restless night, his tiny fist curled around a strand of his mother's auburn hair. "The road's washed out," Jake said quietly, not turning from the window. "Won't be passable for at least 2, maybe 3 days." Emma's shoulders tensed visibly at the news. Jake caught her reflection in the window glass, a mixture of relief and anxiety playing across her features. It was clear she was torn between the safety his home provided and the need to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever had driven her into the storm in the first place. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I never meant to trap you with strangers in your own home." Jake turned from the window, studying her carefully. In the morning light, he could see more clearly the toll that whatever she was running from had taken. Her clothes from the night before, now hanging by the fireplace to dry, bore stains that looked suspiciously like blood. The bruise on her wrist was darker than he had initially noticed, accompanied by finger-shaped marks that spoke of someone gripping her far too tightly. "You're not trapped," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. "And you're not strangers anymore. You're Emma, and this is—" He paused, realizing he didn't know the baby's name. "Michael," Emma supplied softly, looking down at her sleeping son. "His name is Michael. He's 4 months old today, actually." Her voice carried a note of sadness that suggested this birthday wouldn't be celebrated as she had once planned. Jake nodded. filing away the information. Well then, Emma and Michael, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The road being washed out just makes it official. Emma looked up at him with eyes that held unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to us? You don't know anything about me, about what I might have done or what I might be running from. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jake considered his answer carefully. 3 years ago, he would have said it was simply the right thing to do. Now, after so much isolation and self-imposed silence, he wasn't entirely sure what drove his actions. Perhaps it was the way Emma held her son, with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had already lost too much. Perhaps it was the familiar look of grief he recognized in her eyes, the same look he had seen in his own reflection for 3 years. I know enough, Jake said finally. I know you're a mother protecting her child. I know you're running from something that scared you enough to risk traveling in a storm with a baby. And I know that whatever brought you here, you're not the threat in this situation. Emma's breath caught at his words, and for a moment Jake thought she might break down entirely. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. My husband, she said quietly, the words seeming to cost her considerable effort. My late husband. He wasn't a good man. And the people he worked with, they're looking for something they think I have. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of people? Emma shifted Michael to her other arm, buying herself time to formulate her response. The kind who don't ask questions before they hurt people. The kind who would use a baby to get what they want. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The kind who killed him when he tried to get out. The implications of her words settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. Emma wasn't just running from an abusive relationship, she was running from something far more dangerous. The thought of such people coming to his peaceful ranch, threatening the sanctuary he had built, should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a burning need to protect someone other than himself. What do they think you have? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Emma hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Information, names, places, financial records. David kept everything on a computer, and when he died, I was the only one who knew the password. I destroyed it all, but they don't believe me. Jake processed this information, understanding now why Emma had seemed so desperate the night before. She wasn't just seeking shelter from a storm, she was seeking sanctuary from people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. How long have you been running? He asked. 3 weeks, Emma replied, her voice breaking slightly. Ever since the funeral. I thought I could disappear, start over somewhere far away, but they found me in Denver, then again in Fort Collins. I've been driving for 2 days straight, trying to get to my sister in Utah. That's when the storm hit. Jake stood and walked to the window again, his mind working through the implications. The washed-out road that had seemed like an inconvenience minutes earlier now felt like a blessing in disguise. If Emma's pursuers were tracking her, the impassable road would slow them down just as much as it would delay her escape. Your sister in Utah, Jake said. Does she know you're coming? Emma shook her head. I couldn't risk calling. They might be monitoring communications. I hoped if I could get there, she would help me figure out what to do next. Jake turned back to her, seeing the desperation that she was trying so hard to hide. This woman had been carrying an impossible burden for weeks, protecting her child while being hunted by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. The fact that she had survived this long spoke to a strength he was only beginning to understand. The landline here isn't connected to any cell towers, Jake said thoughtfully. It's an old copper line that runs directly to the phone company in town. If you need to call your sister, it would be harder to trace. Emma looked up at him with something approaching hope. You would let me do that? I'd insist on it, Jake replied. But first, we need to get some food into both of you. And I need to check on the cattle, make sure the storm didn't damage the barn. As if summoned by the mention of food, Michael began to stir in Emma's arms. His small whimpers quickly escalated to full-fledged cries, and Emma's face immediately showed the panic of a mother who had no way to feed her child. I'll get to town as soon as the road clears, Jake assured her. But for now, let's see what we can do. He disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a small bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. I remember reading somewhere that babies can drink diluted milk in emergencies. It's not ideal, but it might help until we can get proper formula. Emma watched as Jake prepared the makeshift feeding solution with the careful attention of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between life and death. It occurred to her that this quiet cowboy, who claimed to prefer solitude, had just committed himself to protecting two strangers without asking for anything in return. Why? She asked again. But this time the question carried a different weight. Why are you willing to risk this for us? Jake paused in his preparations, considering the question that went to the heart of who he was becoming in this moment. Because 3 years ago I couldn't protect the person I loved most. Maybe this is my chance to get it right. The honesty in his admission hit Emma like a physical blow. She realized that Jake wasn't just offering shelter, he was offering redemption, both for her and for himself. In caring for her and Michael, he was healing wounds that had been festering in isolation for too long. As Michael finally accepted the improvised formula, settling into contented feeding, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for something more. Hope that there were still good people in the world, people who would risk their own safety to protect others. Outside, the Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, scarred by the storm but enduring. Inside the small ranch house, 3 souls who had been broken by loss and violence began the slow process of healing, bound together by circumstances that had transformed strangers into family. The second day dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that only appeared after Wyoming's most violent storms. Jake stood on his front porch, breathing in the clean air while assessing the damage to his property. Fallen trees blocked the main path to the barn, and the chicken coop had lost half its roof, but the main structures had survived intact. More importantly, the cattle had weathered the storm without casualties, though they would need extra feed to make up for the grazing they had lost. Inside the house, Emma was attempting to fold the blankets Jake had given her, while Michael lay on the couch, fascinated by the play of morning sunlight through the windows. The baby had slept better the previous night, perhaps sensing the safety of their temporary haven, and Emma looked marginally less exhausted than she had upon arrival. "The phone line's working," Jake announced, as he stepped back inside, stomping the mud from his boots. "I tested it this morning. When you're ready, you can call your sister." Emma's hands stilled on the blanket she was folding. "I've been thinking about that all night. What if they're watching her? What if calling her puts her in danger too?" Jake settled into his chair, considering her concern. "What's her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Chen. She married a teacher in Salt Lake City 5 years ago. She doesn't know anything about David's business, but..." Emma's voice trailed off as she voiced her deepest fear. But they might not believe that either. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah. His wife had been named Sarah too, and for a moment, the coincidence felt like more than chance. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the practical concerns. "If you don't call, she won't know you're coming," Jake pointed out gently. "And if these people are as thorough as you say, they'll probably approach her whether you contact her or not. At least if you call, you can warn her." Emma nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as it terrified her. "You're right. I've been running for so long, thinking only about keeping Michael safe. I hadn't considered that my silence might be putting Sarah at risk too." Jake stood and walked to the kitchen window, where he could see the washed-out road stretching into the distance. "The road should be passable by tomorrow afternoon, maybe sooner if the sun keeps up. That gives us time to plan." "Us?" Emma looked up at him, surprised by his use of the plural pronoun. Jake turned back to her, something shifting in his expression. "I'm not letting you face this alone. Not anymore." The declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them was entirely ready to examine. Emma felt tears threatening for the first time since arriving at the ranch, but these were different from the tears of desperation she had been holding back for weeks. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that might have been hope. "I can't ask you to do that," she whispered. "These people, they're dangerous. They've already killed once." "You're not asking," Jake replied firmly. "I'm offering. There's a difference." Before Emma could respond, Michael began to fuss, his small cries indicating hunger. Emma moved to prepare another bottle of the diluted milk Jake had improvised, but he gestured for her to stay seated. "I'll handle it," he said, moving to the kitchen with a confidence that surprised both of them. "You make the call." Emma watched him work, noting the careful way he tested the temperature of the formula, the gentle manner in which he lifted Michael from the couch. For a man who claimed to prefer solitude, he seemed to have a natural instinct for caring for others. With trembling fingers, Emma dialed the number she had memorized years ago. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Sarah?" Emma's voice caught in her throat. "It's Emma. Please don't hang up." The silence on the other end stretched for long seconds before Sarah's voice came through tight with concern. "Emma? My God, where are you? I've been so worried. After David's funeral, you just disappeared. I tried calling, but your phone was disconnected. Emma closed her eyes, gathering the strength to explain. I'm in Wyoming, about 3 hours from Salt Lake City. Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm in trouble, and I might be putting you in danger just by calling. She could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. What kind of trouble? The kind that got David killed, Emma said quietly. There are people looking for me. People who think I have information about David's business. I destroyed everything, but they don't believe me. They've been following me for weeks. Oh, Emma! Sarah's voice was filled with a mixture of fear and compassion. Where are you staying? Are you safe? Emma glanced at Jake, who was now sitting on the couch with Michael, feeding him with the kind of patience that spoke of hidden depths. I'm with someone who's helping me, but Sarah, you need to be careful. If they can't find me, they might come to you looking for information. I don't know anything about David's business, Sarah said, echoing Emma's earlier words. You know that, but they don't, Emma replied. They think family members might know something. You need to be aware, maybe stay somewhere else for a while. There was a pause as Sarah processed this information. Are you coming here? To Salt Lake City? Emma looked at Jake again, who nodded encouragingly. I was planning to. I thought maybe you could help me figure out what to do next, how to disappear properly. Of course, Sarah said without hesitation. Kevin and I have been talking about taking a trip to see his parents anyway. We could leave tonight, and you could stay at the house until you figure things out. The relief Emma felt was overwhelming. Sarah, I can't thank you enough, but you need to be careful. If you see anyone suspicious, if anyone asks questions about me, you need to leave immediately. I understand, Sarah said, though her voice carried the strain of someone trying to process an impossible situation. When will you be here? Emma looked questioningly at Jake, who held up 2 fingers. Tomorrow evening, probably. The road here is washed out, but it should be clear by then. I'll leave a key under the blue flower pot by the back door, Sarah said. The same place we used to hide it when we were kids. Emma, are you sure you're safe where you are? Emma's eyes met Jake's across the room, and she saw something there that made her certain of her answer. Yes, I'm safe. After ending the call, Emma sat in silence for several minutes, watching Jake feed Michael with the kind of natural care that suggested hidden experience. The baby was completely relaxed in his arms, tiny fingers gripping Jake's rough thumb with surprising strength. You're good with him, Emma observed. Jake's expression grew distant. Sarah and I tried to have children. She miscarried twice, late in the pregnancies. After the second time, we decided to wait, to let ourselves heal before trying again. He paused, his voice growing quieter. We never got the chance. Emma felt her heart break for this man who had welcomed her and Michael into his home, who had offered them protection without asking for anything in return. She began to understand that his isolation hadn't been a choice, but a necessity, a way to protect himself from the pain of caring for others. She would be proud of you, Emma said softly, for helping us. Jake looked down at Michael, who had finished eating and was now looking up at him with bright, curious eyes. I hope so. I've spent 3 years wondering if I could have done something different, if I could have prevented the accident. Maybe this is my chance to save someone I actually can save. The weight of his words settled over them both. Emma realized that Jake wasn't just offering her shelter. He was offering her a chance at redemption, just as she was offering him the same thing. In caring for each other, they were both healing from wounds that had seemed impossible to overcome. The road will be clear tomorrow, Jake said, breaking the contemplative silence. But that doesn't mean you have to take it. Emma looked at him confused. What do you mean? I mean, you could stay, Jake said, his voice careful and measured. Both of you. This ranch is isolated off the main roads. It would be hard for anyone to find you here, and I could use the help, especially with someone who needs protecting. The offer hung between them, surprising in its sincerity. Emma looked around the modest ranch house that had become a sanctuary for her and Michael, then at Jake, who was still cradling her son with the gentleness of someone who understood how precious life could be. You barely know us, Emma said, though her voice lacked conviction. I know enough, Jake replied, echoing his words from the day before. I know you're strong enough to protect your son against impossible odds. I know you're smart enough to stay ahead of people who want to hurt you. And I know that you and Michael have made this house feel like a home for the first time in 3 years. Emma felt tears starting to form again, but this time she didn't try to stop them. For the first time since David's death, she felt like she might have found a place where she and Michael could not just survive, but actually live. Outside, the Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly under the clear blue sky, vast and empty and full of possibilities. Inside the ranch house, 3 souls who had been broken by loss and violence continued their slow dance of healing, bound together by circumstances that had transformed strangers into something that might eventually become family. The third morning brought with it a sense of urgency that neither Jake nor Emma wanted to acknowledge. The sun had worked its magic on the muddy road, and by midday it would be passable for a careful driver with four-wheel drive. The time for decision had arrived, and with it, the weight of choosing between the safety of the known and the uncertainty of the unknown. Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake work to clear fallen branches from the path to the barn. Michael was sleeping peacefully in the makeshift crib Jake had constructed from a dresser drawer and several soft blankets. The domestic scene felt surreal after weeks of running, of looking over her shoulder, of never staying in one place long enough to feel safe. The phone rang, shattering the peaceful morning silence. Emma's blood turned to ice as she stared at the device, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possibilities. Who could be calling Jake's isolated ranch? Had someone traced her call to Sarah? "Jake!" she called out urgently, moving away from the phone as if it might bite her. Jake dropped the branch he was carrying and jogged toward the house, immediately sensing the panic in Emma's voice. He found her standing frozen in the kitchen, staring at the still ringing phone. "It could be anyone," Jake said calmly, though Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. Neighbors checking on storm damage, the phone company, the county asking about road conditions. The phone continued to ring, and Jake made the decision for both of them, picking up the receiver with steady hands. "Morrison Ranch," he answered, his voice neutral and carefully controlled. Emma held her breath, watching Jake's face for any sign of danger. His expression remained calm, but she noticed the way his free hand clenched into a fist. "No, this is Jake Morrison. You must have the wrong number," Jake said into the phone. "There's no one here by that name." Emma felt her knees go weak. Someone was asking for her. Somehow, despite all her precautions, they had found her. "No, I haven't seen any strangers in the area," Jake continued, his voice maintaining that same steady calm. "The storm knocked out communications for 2 days. If someone was stranded, they would have had to find shelter elsewhere." There was a pause as Jake listened to the voice on the other end. Emma could hear the faint sound of a man's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. "Well, I hope you find who you're looking for," Jake said finally. "But like I said, there's been no one here but me and my cattle." He hung up the phone and turned to face Emma, whose face had gone completely white. "They found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did they find me?" Jake moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. "Maybe, or maybe they're calling every ranch in a 100-mile radius, hoping to get lucky. The question is, what do we do now?" Emma's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. "I have to leave now, before they come here. I won't let them hurt you because of me." "No," Jake said firmly. "Running got you this far, but it's not a permanent solution. Eventually you'll run out of places to go, and Michael will suffer for it." Emma looked at her sleeping son, her heart breaking at the thought of continuing to drag him from place to place, never able to provide him with stability or safety. "Then what do you suggest?" "These people don't give up, Jake. They killed David, and they'll kill me too if they think it will get them what they want." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the implications of what he was about to suggest. "We make them think you're already dead." Emma stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "Your car," Jake said, his voice gaining conviction as the plan formed in his mind. "Yeah, it's still stuck in the ditch about 2 miles from here, isn't it? What if we made it look like you tried to drive through the storm and didn't make it?" Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "You're talking about faking my death." "I'm talking about buying you time," Jake corrected. "Time to figure out a real solution, time to let the heat die down, time to give Michael the childhood he deserves." The plan was audacious and dangerous, but Emma could see the logic in it. If her pursuers believed she had died in the storm, they might stop looking for her. It would give her the breathing room she desperately needed. "But how?" she asked. "They'll investigate. They'll look for a body." Jake had clearly thought this through. The storm created flash floods throughout the region. Bodies get swept away in floods, sometimes never recovered. It happens more often than people realize. Emma walked to the window, looking out at the landscape that had become her unexpected sanctuary. "And if it doesn't work, if they don't believe it, then we're no worse off than we are right now," Jake said. "But at least we'll have tried something other than running." Emma turned back to him, seeing the determination in his eyes. This man who had lived in isolation for 3 years was willing to risk everything to help her and Michael. The magnitude of his offer was almost overwhelming. "Why?" she asked for the 3rd time since arriving at his ranch. "Why are you willing to do this for us?" Jake looked at Michael, still sleeping peacefully in his makeshift crib, then back at Emma. "Because for the first time in 3 years, I have something worth protecting. Because you and Michael have given me a reason to be more than just a man waiting to die alone on his ranch." The honesty in his words hit Emma like a physical blow. She realized that she wasn't the only one who had been saved by the storm that brought them together. Jake had been drowning in his own grief and isolation, and caring for her and Michael had thrown him a lifeline he hadn't even known he needed. "If we do this," Emma said slowly, "if we fake my death, there's no going back. Emma Hartwell would have to disappear forever. I could never contact my sister again, never reclaim my old life." "Would that be such a loss?" Jake asked gently. "From what you've told me, your old life wasn't much of a life at all." Emma considered his words, thinking about the years with David, the fear and isolation, the constant walking on eggshells. Then she thought about the past 3 days at the ranch, the feeling of safety, the domestic peace she had experienced, watching Jake care for Michael. "What would happen to us?" she asked. "To Michael and me, if we stayed?" Jake's expression softened. "You'd be safe. You'd have a home, a place where Michael could grow up without fear. You'd have someone who cares about both of you, who would do whatever it takes to protect you." Emma heard the unspoken promise in his words, the implication of something deeper than mere protection. She looked around the modest ranch house that had become a sanctuary, then at Jake, who had welcomed them without question and offered them everything he had. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just about me anymore. I have to consider what's best for Michael." Jake nodded, understanding. "Of course, but while you're thinking, I'm going to start making preparations. If we're going to do this, it has to be convincing." As Jake began outlining his plan, Emma found herself caught between terror and hope. The idea of disappearing completely, of leaving Emma Hartwell behind forever, was frightening. But the possibility of a life without fear, of watching Michael grow up in safety, of perhaps finding something like happiness with a man who had already proven his dedication to protecting them, was almost too wonderful to believe. Outside, the Wyoming sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky, burning away the last traces of the storm that had brought them together. Inside the ranch house, 3 souls continued their dance of healing and connection, preparing to make a choice that would determine not just their survival, but their chance at something that might eventually become a real family. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure. By evening, they would have to choose, continue running from the past, or take a leap of faith into an uncertain but hopeful future. The decision would change everything, but as Emma watched Jake gently adjust Michael's blanket, with the tenderness of a natural father, she began to think that maybe, just maybe, some changes were worth the risk. In the distance, the sound of an approaching vehicle could be heard on the newly cleared road. Emma's blood turned cold as she realized their time for planning might have just run out. The moment of truth was approaching faster than any of them had expected, and whatever decision they made would have to be made now, with their lives and Michael's future hanging in the balance. Jake moved to the window, his body tense as he watched the road. "Stay back from the windows," he said quietly, "and be ready to run if I tell you to." Emma gathered Michael in her arms, her heart pounding as she realized that their peaceful interlude might be about to end in violence. The sound of the engine grew closer, and with it, the moment when all their plans would either save them or destroy them completely. The vehicle that emerged from the dust cloud wasn't the black SUV Emma had been dreading for weeks. Instead, it was a battered red pickup truck that belonged to Tom Bradley, Jake's nearest neighbor, and one of the few people who still checked on him regularly. Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief as she recognized the harmless nature of the visitor, but Jake's expression remained tense. "It's Tom," Jake said quietly, but his voice carried a warning. "He's a good man, but he talks a lot. If he sees you here..." Emma understood immediately. In a community as small and isolated as theirs, news traveled fast. If Tom saw her and Michael, word would spread throughout the county within hours. That phone call they'd received earlier proved that Emma's pursuers were already making inquiries in the area. "Take Michael and go to the back bedroom," Jake instructed, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay quiet and don't come out until I give you the all clear." Emma quickly gathered Michael and the few belongings they had spread around the living room, erasing any trace of their presence. As she hurried toward the bedroom, she could hear Tom's truck door slamming and his heavy footsteps approaching the front porch. From the bedroom, Emma could hear the muffled conversation between the 2 men. Tom's voice carried the jovial tone of someone bringing news, but she couldn't make out the specific words. Michael stirred in her arms, and she gently rocked him, praying he wouldn't choose this moment to announce his presence with crying. The conversation seemed to stretch on forever, with Tom's voice occasionally rising in what sounded like concern or excitement. Emma strained to hear, catching fragments about storm damage, washed-out roads, and something about strangers asking questions in town. Her heart rate spiked as she realized Tom might be warning Jake about the very people she was hiding from. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Tom's truck start up and drive away. Emma waited several more minutes before Jake's voice called out, "It's safe, you can come out." Emma emerged from the bedroom to find Jake standing by the window, his face grim as he watched Tom's truck disappear down the road. "What did he say?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Jake turned to face her, and she could see the weight of bad news in his expression. "Two men were in town yesterday asking questions about a woman and baby who might have been in a car accident during the storm. They had your picture, Emma, an old one, but clearly you." Emma felt the familiar cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. What else? They told people they were insurance investigators, looking for a missing beneficiary. Tom said they seemed professional, official, but something about them made the sheriff uncomfortable. He's been asking around, trying to verify their credentials. Emma sank into a chair, the brief respite of the past few days crashing down around her. They're closing in. It's only a matter of time before someone tells them about this place. Jake moved to the window again, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the landscape for signs of danger. Tom also brought news about the road conditions. The main highway is completely clear now. We could have you in Salt Lake City by tonight if we left within the hour. Emma looked at Michael, who was awake and looking around with bright, curious eyes. The idea of putting him back in a car, of returning to the endless cycle of running and hiding, felt like a betrayal of everything she had hoped for these past few days. "Or," Jake continued, his voice carrying a new determination, "we could implement the plan we discussed, but if we're going to do it, it has to be now before they get here." Emma met his eyes, seeing the resolve there. "You're serious about this, about faking my death?" "Dead serious," Jake replied, and despite the gravity of the situation, Emma caught the unintentional pun and felt a brief, hysterical urge to laugh. Jake began pacing the room, his mind clearly working through the logistics. "Your car is still in that ditch 2 miles down the road. The storm created flash flooding in that area. Perfect conditions for someone to get swept away. We stage the scene, make it look like you tried to abandon the car when the water rose, and then Emma Hartwell disappears forever," Emma finished for him. "But you and Michael live," Jake said firmly. "You live and you're safe, and you get to watch him grow up without looking over your shoulder every day." Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast Wyoming landscape that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The rolling hills stretched endlessly toward the horizon, offering both isolation and freedom. For the first time in months, she could envision a future that didn't involve constant fear. "If we do this," she said slowly, "what happens to us? To you, and me, and Michael?" Jake's answer came without hesitation. "We become a family, a real family. I legally adopt Michael, and you become..." He paused, searching for the right words. "You become whoever you want to be. We can say you're my cousin from back east, or a friend who needed a fresh start. Small communities don't ask too many questions about people's pasts if they're good neighbors and contribute to the community." Emma turned to face him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "You would do that, legally adopt Michael?" "I'd be honored to," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That boy has already changed my life more than he'll ever know. I'd be proud to call him my son." The weight of the decision pressed down on Emma like a physical force. Everything she had known, everyone she had been, would cease to exist. But in exchange, she and Michael would have something she had never dared to hope for, a real home, with someone who genuinely cared about their welfare. "How long would we have?" Emma asked. "To set up the scene, I mean." Jake glanced at his watch. "If they're following the same pattern Tom described, asking questions, gathering information, they'll probably be here by late afternoon or evening. That gives us maybe 4 hours. 4 hours to disappear one life and create another. 4 hours to take a leap of faith that would determine the rest of their future." Emma looked at Michael, who chose that moment to smile up at her, his tiny hand reaching toward her face with perfect trust. "Okay," Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Let's do it." Jake nodded grimly and began outlining the plan in detail. They would drive to Emma's abandoned car, stage evidence of a desperate attempt to escape rising floodwaters, and plant just enough personal items to make the scene convincing without making it obvious. Emma's purse, with her identification and some personal effects, would be found partially buried in mud downstream from the car. It would look like she had tried to save herself and Michael, but had been overcome by the flood. "What about Michael?" Emma asked. "There has to be some evidence that he was with me." Jake's expression grew pained. A baby blanket, maybe a small toy, something that would have floated away but might have been caught in debris downstream. The cold practicality of planning her own death was surreal, but Emma forced herself to focus on the details. Every element had to be perfect, convincing enough to fool people who were trained to detect deception. As they gathered the items they would need, Emma felt a strange sense of mourning for the life she was about to leave behind. Emma Hartwell, with all her flaws and mistakes, her pain and her memories, would cease to exist in a few hours. In her place would be someone new, someone who had the chance to build a life based on love and hope rather than fear and survival. "Are you ready?" Jake asked, loading the last of their supplies into his truck. Emma looked around the ranch house one more time, at the place where she had found unexpected sanctuary and the beginning of something that might become love. When she left this house again, she would be someone else entirely, stepping into a future that was both terrifying and full of promise. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, settling Michael in his makeshift car seat. As they drove toward the site where Emma Hartwell would disappear forever, Emma felt a mixture of terror and anticipation. Behind them lay 3 years of Jake's isolation and 3 weeks of her desperate flight. Ahead lay the unknown, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, the unknown felt like possibility rather than threat. The Wyoming sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. By the time it set, Emma Hartwell would be gone, but in her place would be someone new, someone who had a chance at happiness, at family, at the kind of life she had never dared to dream possible. A widow knocked on his door with nothing but a baby. The silent cowboy just said, "Come in." Block 06, Novo Amanecer. The scene at Emma's abandoned car was more convincing than either of them had dared hope. 3 days of exposure to the elements had already begun the process of making the staged accident look authentic. Jake worked with methodical precision, placing Emma's purse strategically downstream, partially buried in silt and debris. The small blue baby blanket that had kept Michael warm during their first night at the ranch now served a different purpose, caught convincingly in the branches of a fallen tree where floodwaters would have deposited it. Emma stood nearby, watching Jake arrange the evidence of her own demise with a mixture of fascination and horror. Michael, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, dozed peacefully in her arms, occasionally stirring when a bird called from the nearby trees. "That should do it," Jake said, stepping back to survey their work. The story writes itself. Desperate mother trying to escape rising water, caught by the current, swept away with her child. Emma nodded, but couldn't bring herself to speak. The finality of what they were doing hit her like a physical blow. After today, she could never go back. Emma Hartwell would be officially dead, and with her would die any chance of reconnecting with her sister Sarah, her childhood home, or any remnant of her previous life. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jake asked gently, seeing the conflict in her expression. Emma looked down at Michael, then back at the man who had risked everything to give them both a chance at a real life. "No," she said firmly. "No second thoughts. Just mourning, I guess, for who I used to be." Jake moved closer, his weathered hand gentle on her shoulder. "Who you used to be brought you to my door. That woman was strong enough to protect her child, smart enough to survive against impossible odds, and brave enough to trust a stranger. Those parts of you aren't dying today. They're just getting a new name." As they drove back to the ranch, Emma felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight she had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The constant fear of being found, the exhaustion of always looking over her shoulder, the desperate uncertainty about the future, all of it was being left behind with the staged accident scene. Back at the ranch house, Jake immediately began implementing the next phase of their plan. He called the sheriff's office to report seeing what might have been car lights in the flood area during the storm, suggesting that someone should check the washed-out section of road. The call was made with the perfect tone of a concerned neighbor, rather than someone with inside knowledge, and Jake's reputation in the community ensured that his report would be taken seriously. "They'll investigate by tomorrow morning," Jake told Emma as he hung up the phone. "By evening, they'll have found enough evidence to conclude that you and Michael were caught in the flood. Within a week, the case will be closed." Emma nodded, understanding that they were crossing a point of no return. And then we start over," Jake said simply. "We create new identities, new histories. You become Anna Morrison, my cousin from Massachusetts, who came west after losing her husband. Michael becomes my nephew, legally adopted after the tragic loss of his parents." The name felt strange on Emma's tongue when she tried it out. "Anna Morrison." After a moment, she nodded. "I can live with that." 3 hours later, as the sun was setting over the Wyoming landscape, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch. Emma's heart rate spiked until she realized there were too many engines. This wasn't the two-man team that had been hunting her, but rather the sheriff's department responding to Jake's report. They watched from the window as Sheriff Martinez and 2 deputies drove past toward the accident site. Within the hour, they were back, stopping at the ranch to interview Jake about what he might have seen during the storm. Emma and Michael stayed hidden in the back bedroom, while Jake gave his statement with the perfect blend of helpfulness and ignorance. He had seen lights, yes, sometime during the worst of the storm. No, he hadn't thought to investigate at the time. The conditions were too dangerous. Yes, he was willing to help search if they needed volunteers. After the officers left, Jake returned to the bedroom where Emma was waiting with barely contained anxiety. "It's done," he said quietly. "They found everything exactly as we planted it. They're treating it as a tragic accident, probable death by drowning. They'll search for a few more days, but they won't find anything," Emma finished. "Because Emma Hartwell is dead." Jake nodded, then sat beside her on the bed where she was holding Michael. "Are you okay with that? Really okay?" Emma considered the question seriously. Was she okay with erasing her entire previous existence? With never again being able to contact the few people who had cared about her? With raising Michael under a completely fabricated identity? Looking at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms, she realized the answer was surprisingly simple. "I'm more than okay with it," she said. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm free. We're free." Jake reached out and gently touched Michael's tiny hand, marveling at how something so small could have changed his entire world. "What do you think he'll remember about all this?" "Nothing," Emma said with certainty. "He's too young. When he grows up, all he'll know is that this ranch is his home, that you're his father, and that he's loved unconditionally. That's not a bad foundation for a life." Jake looked up at her, seeing the strength and determination that had carried her through the worst weeks of her life. "And what about us? What are we to each other in this new life we're creating?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "That depends on what you want us to be." Jake's answer came without hesitation. "I want us to be a family, a real family. Not just 3 people sharing a house, but 3 people who choose each other every day, who build something together that's stronger than what any of us could be alone." Emma felt tears starting to form, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than fear. "I'd like that too, very much." As if sensing the emotional significance of the moment, Michael stirred in Emma's arms and opened his eyes, looking up at both adults with that bright, trusting gaze that had melted Jake's heart from the first night. "Hello, little man," Jake said softly, gently stroking the baby's cheek. "Welcome to your new life." 6 months later, the ranch looked completely different. Emma, now legally Anna Morrison, had transformed the austere bachelor dwelling into a warm family home. Flower boxes graced the windows, a vegetable garden flourished behind the house, and children's toys were scattered across the front porch, where Michael spent his days playing while his parents worked. Jake had never imagined how much joy a baby could bring to his quiet life. Michael's first steps had been taken across the ranch house living room. His first word had been "da-da," directed at Jake, and his laughter filled spaces that had been silent for far too long. Anna had bloomed in the safety and stability of their new life. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by a contentment that made her more beautiful than Jake had thought possible. She had thrown herself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found where she belonged. They had married in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Ridge courthouse, with Tom Bradley and his wife serving as witnesses. To their neighbors, it was a natural progression, Jake finally finding happiness again after years of mourning, and Anna finding security for herself and her son after the tragic loss of her husband. The investigation into Emma Hartwell's disappearance had been closed after 2 weeks. The men who had been hunting her had eventually accepted the official conclusion and moved on to other concerns. Emma Hartwell was listed as presumed dead, victim of a flash flood, and the case was filed away and forgotten. On a crisp autumn morning, as Jake taught Michael to feed the chickens and Anna hung laundry on the line behind the house, she paused to watch the two most important people in her world. Michael, now walking confidently and chattering in his own baby language, held Jake's finger as they scattered feed for the eager birds. The sight filled Anna with a peace she had never experienced before. This was what family looked like, not perfect, not without challenges, but built on a foundation of love, trust, and mutual commitment. Michael would grow up knowing he was wanted, protected, and cherished. Jake had found purpose and joy again after years of isolation, and she had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings came from the most desperate endings. As the Wyoming wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the plains, Anna smiled and returned to her laundry. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight they would sit by the fire as a family, reading stories to Michael and planning for a future that stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. The silent cowboy, who had once said simply, "Come in," to a desperate woman, and her baby had found his voice again through love. The widow who had knocked on his door with nothing but hope had found a home where she could finally stop running, and the baby who had been born into danger and uncertainty had found parents who would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. In the end, the storm that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of the life they were all meant to live.